Okay, so what does absolutism mean? It means that the government holds absolute power, meaning complete power. Okay, and 100% of that power under absolutism is held by the king. Okay, it's not held by parliament, it's not held by the peasants. Okay, it is held by the king, 100% of that power. Now, what gives him all of that power? That would be the divine right theory. This is the use of religion to legitimize rule. And we've seen this before. Europe's not the only one that uses religion for political purposes. In the Aztec Empire, remember that they needed human sacrifice in order to continue the world. That was a part of their religion. And so they established tributary states where they forced their tributary states to give them people for human sacrifices. In China, you have the mandate of heaven, where if the gods were pleased, then things would go well. You would have prosperity. If the gods were displeased, then you would have famine and war and disease, and that was a sign to overthrow the dynasty. Well, the divine right theory doesn't give you that loophole. It doesn't allow you to overthrow your ruler. If things go poorly, if there's famine or war or disease, then you still got to follow the king, because God is all-knowing and all-powerful, and he put that king in charge. So you really have no recourse for if you have a bad king. It's just, well, that's the way things are. You have to follow them. Okay, now what are the dynasties in Europe that followed the divine right theory? Well, the Bourbon Dynasty, the Stuart Dynasty, and the Habsburg Dynasty. Those are all dynasties that follow absolute rule. Now, the Bourbon Dynasty replaced the Valois. When Henry III in the War of the Three Henrys was assassinated, Henry IV of Navarre started the Bourbon Dynasty. Now, what country did the Valois and Bourbon dynasties rule? France, exactly right. Once the Valois dynasty is gone, the Bourbon dynasty comes in, and they're going to be absolute rulers. When the Tudor dynasty ends with Elizabeth I, okay, she has no heir. That starts the Stuart dynasty from Scotland. Now, the Stuart dynasty not only rules Scotland, but also rules where? After the Tudor dynasty ended. England, good. Now, the Tudor dynasty was not absolute. The Tudor dynasty ruled with a parliament. They shared power, dating all the way back to the Magna Carta with King John. But James Stuart, James I, is used to ruling Scotland with 100% of the power. So when the Stuart dynasty gets established in England, he's going to want to rule England the same way he rules Scotland. And so there's going to be civil war in England over absolutism. Okay, so the Bourbon dynasty was an absolute monarchy in France. Stuart dynasty was an absolute monarchy in England. What about the Habsburg dynasty? What countries did they control? Spain and the Holy Roman Empire, until, with the 30 Years' War, the Holy Roman Empire fell apart and had 300 different rulers, noble lords within the Germanic areas. Okay, so the Habsburg family continued to rule Spain, but remember, after the 30 Years' War, they were critically weakened. So Spain is no longer in its golden age. Now France is in its golden age with the Bourbon dynasty. Okay, so it's important to know which dynasties are absolute: Bourbon, Stuart, Habsburg, which dynasties they replaced, and where each of these dynasties ruled in Europe. Are we good so far? Excellent. So what is absolutism? Well, absolutism is the belief that God gave the kings power. Well, how do you know that God chose that king? He's not like sending a DM or putting a memo up in churches saying, hey, this guy Louis XIV, he's my boy. Okay. Instead, they use the idea of primogeniture. Primogeniture is the inheritance of the estate going to the eldest son. So when a king dies, how do we know who's next? His son is the next to be king. So primogeniture relies on the divine right of kings by saying God provided that king with an heir. God provided a continuation of the dynasty. Therefore, the kings have divine right from God. Now, are you going to go up against God? Nope, that is a bad move. Going against the kings is the same as going against the gods. So again, using religion to legitimize political power. Now, our best example of what it means to be an absolute monarch is Louis XIV of France, the Sun King, because he was the light that shone on France. It's under his rule that France enters its golden century. And so he's not very humble about that fact. He's like, yeah, it's because of me. I'm France. So when you look at this painting, and y'all are going to have to interpret documents for content as well as for hip skills. If we were to look at this as a document in a DBQ, we have a lot of symbolism in this painting. Okay, here is an angel. Now, where do angels come from? Heaven. Okay, so God sent an angel, and that angel's carrying a flag with a sun on it. Okay, Louis XIV is the Sun King. So you have an angel carrying the flag and the symbol of the King of France. And then what is this angel doing to Louis XIV? What is this? This is a crown. Good, Taylor. She is crowning him. And she is sent by God. So God's messenger is crowning Louis XIV. This is all about divine right theory. So if you were to give a content statement for this document, the painting depicts Louis XIV being crowned by an angel sent from heaven. That's the summary. That's the main idea. What is historical context? Well, the historical context is that in France, the divine right of theory said that God put the kings in charge, and therefore they wielded absolute power, which Louis XIV wielded for 72 years over France. Okay, now intended audience, clearly this is a pro Louis XIV depiction. They're showing him as having the favor of God. Okay, so this is meant to be shown to people who may not be literate, okay, but they can get the message of this guy is in charge. And the purpose is pro-absolutism propaganda. Okay, this is pro-Louis XIV. It is showing him in a positive view. Now, can you do point of view? No, because we don't know who made this painting. We don't know if they're French. We don't know if they're English. We don't know, who they are, what they did, or what their opinion was. Okay, but we can summarize the painting and give historical background, intended audience, or the purpose of this document. Okay, and it is showing that the divine right of kings was a main factor in absolutism. Are we good so far? Okay, so what are some characteristics of absolutism? Well, number one, religion is used to support rule. The divine right of kings is a critical characteristic of absolutism. Can't talk about absolutism without talking about the divine right of kings, because God put the kings in charge, gave them complete authority, and going against the kings means you're going against God. and that means you're bad, and you're going to HE double hockey sticks when you die. Okay, so using Catholicism in particular, using religion to shore up political power, which is not just a European phenomenon. We see it in many other cultures throughout world history. Okay, another defining feature of absolutism is that there's only one person in charge. You have centralized government. That one person is the monarch, and in a patriarchy, it's usually going to be a king. They control all aspects of state. They can raise or lower taxes. They can create a military. They can pass a law. They can have people jailed. They can have people executed. They decide the budget for the country. They don't share power with a parliament. Okay, they control everything, central government, as opposed to the decentralized government that we see in the Holy Roman Empire, where there's a bunch of different nobles trying to decide what religion to follow and what lands to take. Okay, another feature of absolutism is that we see a change over time from the medieval age. In the medieval age, under feudalism, okay, vassal lords would give land in exchange for favors. One of those favors is, if I call you up to battle, you show up. So if you've got to fight a war, let's say that your neighbor is a jerk and you want to go invade him and take all the stuff. Well, you need to build an army. Do you have an army just standing there waiting for you to point them at your enemies? No. Yeah, you have to DM, you have to send messages to your feudal lords, and you have to say, hey, I'm going to go fight my neighbor. I need you to send me troops. And then you got to wait for a reply. And that reply is probably going to say, okay, give me a couple of weeks to round up some serfs, give them pointy objects, train them how to poke things with the pointy objects, and then I'll send them your way so you can point them at your enemy. Well, that takes a lot of time. Okay, that is not efficient. That is not quick. After the medieval period, governments start creating careers for soldiers rather than just snatching up people and giving them pointy sticks and saying, you're a soldier now. Okay, so they start forming professional armies, even during peacetime. Okay, so even if you don't have a war to fight, you're still paying the salaries for soldiers. You're still paying for training. You're still paying for weapons for your soldiers, so that when it comes time to call them up for battle, they are ready to go. They are ready to mobilize. To mobilize means to prepare for war. So they can very quickly, okay, start their battles and get to where they need to go because they're already trained. There's no prep work. They're professionals. You just call them in when it's time for you to go to war. Okay, so instead of relying on unqualified farmers and saying, hey, I'm going to go have you fight my enemies, and then if you survive, you can come back and work on my land. Now they're specifically training people to be soldiers, and that's going to be a much more effective military. Now, are the kings only going to use the military against external enemies? No. This isn't just oh, I'm the king of France, and if the king of Spain tries to invade me, I want to have an army. This is also so they can put down internal unrest. If you're an absolute king and there's a noble talking out of pocket, getting smart, okay, talking trash, then you could send your army to go take out that noble because that's an internal threat. Okay, because now you have a large army. Even if you're not at war with a foreign adversary, you still have an army that you can point at any enemies, foreign or domestic. Okay, so how do they have power? They use religion, they use military force, and they use a lot of money. Now, how does a government get money? From taxes. So they use taxes, which remember, they're in charge. They control all aspects of states. So if they want more money, all they got to do is raise taxes and it's done. Okay, they're going to use that money to show off, to build infrastructure to support their rule. Just like we saw with Justinian the Great, building the Hippodrome and the Hagia Sophia. Building fancy buildings shows off your power. In France, they're going to build the Palace of Versailles. It is going to be the bougiest palace of all time. Y'all, it takes almost 3 decades. It takes 28 years to build this palace. And it is going to have so much just like gilded everything, crystals, paintings on the ceiling, a hall of mirrors. And like nowadays we're like, oh, a mirror, I can get that anywhere. I can use my phone as a mirror. But back then, y'all, mirrors were expensive. Glass was expensive. It wasn't just something you found in the wilderness. You had to manufacture it. So how mirrors were made was they would take that glass and they'd put a coating of silver behind it. And that would cause a reflection. So glass is expensive, silver is expensive, so mirrors are going to be expensive. And Versailles was so fancy, it had an entire hall of mirrors, not just one little circle that you have to go to look at, the entire hall, which is full of mirrors. Also, that's the reason you can't see vampires in mirrors, is because they were coated with a layer of silver for the reflection. So that's the reason that in mythology, vampires can't be seen in mirrors. Although in modern day mirrors, we don't use silver anymore, we use aluminum. So technically, I think vampires would be able to show up in reflections in today's mirrors. If y'all ever come across a vampire, let me know. And then in Russia, the equivalent of this is Peterhof. Peter the Great, a great Russian czar, is going to try to westernize. He's going to try to make Russia more like Western Europe. And so he builds his own Versailles. It awes and inspires and shows off their clout and how powerful they are. So they use money, religion, and the military to shore up their power, to maintain their power. Does that make sense so far? All right. So Bishop Jacques Busat, who as a bishop, he is a member of the clergy, the Catholic clergy specifically. So the church and the state are going to be very closely working together. He is pro-divine right. He is pro-absolutism. He is going to support the idea of the divine right in kings, particularly under the rule of Louis XIV. So this is the church saying that the king is chosen by God, and therefore he doesn't owe anything to his people or to his government. The only person he owes anything to is God. Okay, so absolute control, mostly through religion. Are we good so far? All right. So France is going to be our best example of absolutism. So we have to talk about the Bourbon Dynasty. Y'all may remember that the Bourbon Dynasty replaced the Valois after the War of the Three Henrys, when Henry of Navarre was the last Henry standing. Remember, the war got started by Catherine de' Medici, the Queen Mother, when she had the St. Bartholomew Days massacre on the day of his wedding, but he and Margaret survived, thus starting the War of the Three Henrys. He was the last one, Henry IV. So the Valois dynasty is out. He starts the Bourbon dynasty. Okay, also remember, he was a Huguenot, but then he converted to Catholicism. So the Bourbon dynasty is going to be Catholic, and it uses religion to support their rule. Now, to continue a dynasty, you need an heir. So Henry's heir was Louis XIII. After Louis XIII, you have Louis XIV. Louis XIV is the big one. He is the Sun King, the one being crowned by heaven. Louis XV, we don't really need to know a lot about him. Just as a summary of how he was as a ruler, he really liked money and he really liked women. So he spent a lot of money on women, which really hurt the tax brackets in France. And so he wasn't a particularly good ruler. And then Louis XVI comes to power when France is broke. And so he's going to, again, try to raise taxes. People are going to be upset about those taxes being raised. And he's not a very strong ruler. And so they're going to revolt. The French Revolution starts. And as a result of that French Revolution, Louis XVI and his queen, Marie Antoinette, are going to be beheaded for treason. So the same thing that happened to Queen Mary of Scots is going to happen to King Louis XVI and his wife, Marie Antoinette. You may know of her as the woman who allegedly said, oh, they don't have bread, let them eat cake. Well, that's actually propaganda. The French the nobility were trying to get power away from the monarchy, so they started anti-monarchy propaganda. They particularly didn't like Marie Antoinette because she was foreign. She was from Germany, married into the family, and they didn't like how much the family was spending and how France was broke. And so they made up that lie about her saying, oh, they can't eat bread. Well, why don't they eat cake? Well, how many peasants are going to ever see a cake? Like, you can't afford bread, you're definitely not affording cake. Okay. And so that starts the French Revolution and a crash course in democracy that ends up ending really badly. Lots of people are going to die. It's actually called the Reign of Terror, when Maximilian Robespierre just starts beheading like everybody. Okay, but we'll get to that. That's an interesting point in history. Okay, so Louis XIII, the heir of Henry IV, comes to power, and his right-hand man is Cardinal Richelieu. Cardinal means he's a member of the clergy, the Catholic clergy. However, Richelieu is going to put the political over the religious because he is a politique. And a politique knows that they've got to walk carefully to keep their power. And so they're willing to put religion to the side. So even though Cardinal Richelieu was a French Catholic, when France enters the 30 Years' War, he is going to convince the king, we don't need to side with the Catholics, even though we're Catholic, because the Catholics are the Habsburgs. They're our political enemies. So it would make more sense for us to side with the Protestant Germans to try and take down the Catholic Habsburgs. Okay? So he is a politique, putting the political over the religious. And he is going to play a defining role in increasing the power of the monarchy, because that's his number one goal. He wants France to be number one. And so he helped set the stage for Louis XIV to come in and be the absolute ruler, the Sun King, who actually ushers France into its golden age. So the Habsburg Dynasty, Spain, no more golden age. Now France is it. However, Louis XIV is going to spend a lot of money, and he's going to fight a lot of wars, which cost money. And so he is going to leave his successors with very little options in terms of finances, and that's going to weaken their powers, which increases the power of the nobility, eventually overthrowing the absolute monarchy and trying to establish a democratic government. Okay, so this is context for, here's where the Louis came from. Henry of Navarre. You have 13th, 14th, 15th, and 16th. The main ones we need to concern ourselves with are the 14th and then eventually the 16th. Are we good so far? All right. So what was French society like at this time? Well, there were three sections to French society. Now, obviously, the king rules at the top, okay? But not everybody can be king. There's only one king. You also have the clergy, okay? The people who work for the church. That's cardinals, bishops, but also includes the poorer members of the clergy, the monks, the nuns, and the priests. Now, they make up about 1% of the total population. So very, very small amount on this triangular hierarchy. Okay, but they don't have to pay taxes. Now, these clergy members often have a lot of power. If you're a bishop or a cardinal, you've got clout, but they don't have to pay any taxes to the country. The second estate is made up of the nobility. They're about 3 to 4%. So if you add these together, states 1 and 2 are about 5% of the population. So your dukes and your lords and duchesses, all of them are nobility. First and second estate don't pay taxes. So the majority of the French population falls into the third estate, about 95%. And they're the ones who pay taxes to the government. Now, the bourgeoisie are the middle class. They're comfortable. They're not poor, but they're not rich. You do have some people in the bourgeoisie who become rich and they buy their way out of the third estate. Now, why would they want to move out of the third estate and become nobility? What incentive do they get? They don't have to pay taxes. Exactly, TJ. But there's an issue with that. If you start allowing the rich people in the third estate to buy their way into a tax-free bracket, that means that the only people you have left in the third estate are going to be the people with the least amount of money. Is taxing the poor a great way to build up a lot of revenue for your country? No, it is not. It's also a great way to start a revolution because the peasants are going to get sick and tired of this format. However, under Louis XVI, when the Estates General, which is kind of like French Parliament. Now the 14th, Louis XIV wouldn't call this Parliament because he's like, I'm in charge. Neither did Louis XV, but Louis XVI was not as strong. And so the Estates General gets called to vote on taxation. The third estate wants the first and second estate to pay some of the taxes. Well, each class gets one vote. First estate gets one vote, second estate gets one vote, and the third estate gets one vote. Now, how do you think the first and second estate are going to vote? Are they going to vote for taxing themselves or against taxing themselves? Yeah, Elizabeth, they're going to vote no. So it's going to be 2 votes to 1. The first and second estate join up and say, hey, it's 2 to 1. You can't tax us. Peasants still have to pay the taxes. Okay. And remember, a lot of that money is being spent on a standing army and on fancy palaces that the peasants don't ever get to attend. The peasants aren't showing up to Versailles and they're like, hey, let me get a tour. My tax dollars pay for this. Only the nobles and the monarchy get to enjoy those luxuries. Okay, so when Henry IV comes to power, he's going to start selling noble positions. He's going to say, if you give me enough money, I'll give you a noble title. That's going to lead to this exodus of the wealthy people in the third estate up into the second estate so that they move out of that tax bracket. Okay, so less revenue for the country. Now, France at this time is primarily agrarian. That's just a fancy word for agricultural. So lots of farming. The majority of the population don't live in cities. They live in the countryside. It's also the largest country in Europe with about 20% of the European population. So when famine hits during the French Revolution and the third estate can't make food or buy food, that's going to lead to social unrest. And the government can't import food because they're broke, because they spent it on Versailles and they spent it on wars, and they're not getting enough tax revenue from taxing the poorest people in their society. Okay, so if you're looking for cause and effect, okay, some foreshadowing. Now, with documents, okay, you are going to have to be able to interpret not just text, but pictures. This picture is showing French society. Now we know that there are 4 parts to French society. There's the king, the first estate, the second estate, and the third estate. Okay, this guy is wearing a very fancy hat and has a cross attached to his belt. So this represents which estate? The clergy, the first estate. Good. This guy has a fancy hairdo and fashionable mustache and is holding paperwork, okay? And so he likely represents the nobility, the second estate. This represents the king, okay, because he's wearing this fancy sash. So who does that leave down here, shackled in chains and starving? the peasants, the third estate, the people who are carrying the rest of France. Their tax money is making it possible for the king and the nobles to party at Versailles. It's making it possible to pay tithes to the Catholic Church. What do they get out of all of this? Well, nothing. They're being worked to death and taxed to death so that these guys can be freeloaders. They could carry themselves. They can get off of this guy's back and walk, but they're choosing not to. Instead, they are controlling the third estate and taking their money through taxation. So if you were to give a summary of the main idea of this document, a content statement, it would be this cartoon represented the estates in France, namely the first estate with the clergy, the second estate with the nobility, and the third estate with the peasants. If you were going to do hit, you can't do point of view because you don't know who made this cartoon, but you could give historical context. In France, the first and the second estate did not have to pay taxes, which put most of the tax burden on the peasants. Or you could say that the king spent much of the tax revenue on building palaces and fighting wars that did not benefit the peasants. For intended audience, well, this isn't a written work. These aren't words on a piece of paper. So this is accessible to people who are illiterate. They may not be able to read a long article complaining about the economy of France, but they can definitely interpret a picture. Okay, much like the stained glass windows that you see in Catholic churches. Those are meant to allow the lower classes, the illiterate, to have information about the topic. In terms of purpose, well, this puts the third estate in a very sympathetic light. Okay, this makes the first and second estate and the king look like freeloaders. So the purpose of this is anti-absolutism propaganda. It is pro third estate. It's probably pro the raising of taxes on the first and second estate. So you can do H, I, and P of hit, but you can't do point of view because you don't know who made this cartoon. Are they French? Are they English? Okay, you don't know, are they male? Are they female? What's their religion? You don't know. Does that make sense so far? Okay, excellent. All right, so Cardinal Richelieu, he was the right-hand man of Louis the 13th. He helped set the stage for Louis the 14th to be able to rule with as much power as he had. Now remember, he is a politique. So he puts the political over the religious. Even though he's a member of the Catholic clergy, his number one goal is to make France number one. So that means getting rid of France's enemies. If that means siding with the Protestant Germans, then so be it. Okay, so they side with the Protestants against the Habsburgs in the 30 Years' War, and that helps build up France into its golden age. Now, his political goal, since he put politics over everything else, is the total control of all groups under the king. So he is very much pro-absolutism. Now, after the 30 Years' War, you'll remember that we don't fight wars over religion anymore. We fight wars over balance of power, making sure that no one country becomes too big or too strong that it starts threatening other European countries. Now, eventually, France is going to fall under some scrutiny for that. When Napoleon comes to power after the French Revolution, the rest of Europe is going to be like, oh, no. We've got to put a stop to this. Napoleon's too powerful. We're not fighting him because of his religion. We're fighting him because he has too much power, and we've got to take him down. Okay, so how did Cardinal Richelieu build up the power of the monarchy? Well, there's a constant power struggle between the nobles and the king. The nobles want more power. The king wants more power, and there's only so much power to go around. So Richelieu has to eliminate the nobles as a threat. He has to figure out a way to decrease their power and increase the kings. And so he creates a spy network of intendants. These are representatives of the king that are loyal to the king. Now, they do some regular job stuff aside from being a spy. They enforce laws. They recruit soldiers for the standing army. They collect taxes to make sure money is going to the government to pay for the standing army and to pay for what the king is doing. But they also spy on the nobles. This way, Cardinal Richelieu and Louis XIII can hear if people are plotting against them. And they can squash any revolution before it starts. Now, Cardinal Richelieu's main focus is going to be on the Huguenots, which are French Calvinists. Henry IV was a Huguenot, but he converted to Catholicism because political over the religious. Remember, he is a politique. Now, the Huguenots are very powerful in the Second Estate. They make up about half of the Second Estate, and they're very, very wealthy. Therefore, Richelieu sees them as a threat to the king's power. So that Edict of Nantes that established religious toleration of the Huguenots, Cardinal Richelieu is going to try to get rid of that because he sees the Huguenots as a threat to absolute power. Take down the nobles in order to increase the monarch's power. Are we good so far? Intendants are spies. They're a part of a spy network, but they also do other things like enforce laws, collect taxes, and recruit soldiers. But they're sent in with like, oh, your job is to collect taxes and don't tell the nobles, but you're also spying on them and reporting back to us. It's because of Richelieu's foundation of a spy network trying to create the subordination of everybody in France under the monarchy that Louis XIV, the heir to Louis XIII, that when Louis XIV comes to power, he's going to be able to wield it very, very effectively. Okay, this French statement, l'état c'est moi, that means the state, that's me in French. He is saying, I am the state. I am France. France is nothing without me. I am the government. I can raise taxes. I can raise a military. I can do whatever I want because I am the one who's been given the power through the divine right theory to rule. And he's going to take that very, very seriously. He is our best example of an absolute monarch in Europe because he wields that absolute power so completely and for so long. He is going to reign for 72 years. Okay, and that's not just being alive for 72 years. That's him being king for 72 years. So he's going to be critical in the development of France as a superpower, which remember, the Spanish were the superpower in the 16th century. The French become the European superpower in the 17th century. So Louis XIV brings France into its golden age. France becomes the superpower of Europe. French culture becomes the definition of high society. Okay, the best symbol of extravagance and culture. French becomes the language of the diplomats. So no matter where you live in Europe, you're gonna have to learn how to speak French. Okay, because if your governments are going to communicate, all the governments are communicating in French because French became the language of the well-educated, replacing Latin. It used to be that Latin was the language of the well-educated, but Latin is a dead language. So now the vernacular language of French becomes the #1 language in Europe. And France also becomes the center of literature and the arts and philosophy. Okay, so they are really, really powerful during this period of time, including with French fashion. They're gonna like the whole wearing wigs and men wearing high heels. Y'all know that high heels were actually invented for men because they can stay in the stirrups that you use when you ride a horse. And calves were like the biggest sign of beauty for men. Like guys were always showing off their legs in tights. They're showing off their calves because that was considered like super sexy. In terms of female fashion, y'all may remember like the little beauty mark on the upper lip. They would also take mouse fur and glue it to their eyebrows. So they would have like mouse fur eyebrows, like that was considered sexy. And they'd have these giant wigs that they never washed, right? So these wigs are full of like hair, but also wax to keep them standing up, and they smelled horrible. And they're also easily flammable. So I'm sure that made for a number of party fouls at the Palace of Versailles. Okay, but that was fashion. So y'all can make fun of millennials for skinny jeans and middle parts, but at least we weren't gluing mouse fur to our eyebrows. And maybe it'll come back. Fashion cycles through. Are we good on this slide? Now I mentioned the Palace of Versailles, and the Palace of Versailles is going to be Louis XIV's very, very extravagant home. Now he already had a palace in Paris, the Tuileries, but that wasn't good enough for him. Okay, so he is going to spend almost 30 years building the biggest, baddest palace in all of Europe. And he's going to move it outside of the capital, outside of Paris, into the countryside. Okay, now this palace isn't just something that he built because he was like, I like nice things. He built it because it legitimizes his rule. Okay, building such an extravagant piece of infrastructure reinforces his image as an all-powerful ruler. It shows that he's powerful enough and wealthy enough to have these extremely nice things. However, it's gonna be very expensive, not only building the palace, but also maintaining the palace. It costs over half of the royal revenue each year to maintain Versailles, because even after you build it, you still got to keep it standing, you got to keep it clean, you got to pay for servants, okay, you got to throw parties and all that. It's going to cost a lot to keep this palace clean and extravagant. So this is a super expensive cost to France. Now remember, how does the government make money? They charge taxes. Who in France pays taxes?
Peasant.
The peasants, the third estate. Okay, the first estate, the clergy, they don't pay taxes. The second estate, the nobles, they don't pay taxes. It's all the third estate. Now, do the peasants, do the people of the third estate ever get to hang out in Versailles and party because it's their tax money that's paying for it in the first place? They're not letting peasants into the Versailles Palace to party. Okay, so this is not for the peasants, and yet they're the ones who are funding this palace. So that's going to lead to some social unrest, especially under Louis XVI's rule, when France goes through an economic crisis, not having enough food to feed its population. Well, if you're starving and you see all these nobles and fancy get-ups and fancy wigs with mouse eyebrows eating cake and sipping champagne while you're starving eating sawdust mixed flour for your bread, you're gonna have you're gonna be a little salty about that situation. Okay, now who did get to use the Palace of Versailles? Well, obviously the king, he lives there, but also the nobles. Okay, Louis XIV forced the nobles to live at Versailles for a large part of the year. Now, the nobles had their own homes. They had their own land, their own territories, their own manors. Why did they have to live at this palace? Well, because Louis XIV wanted to keep an eye on them. He wanted to make sure that they were too distracted, too busy with festivities and fun stuff to be able to plot against him and undermine his rule. So this becomes a pleasure prison for the French nobility. They have to live at Versailles for a large part of the year, where he can keep an eye on them, and he keeps them very busy with just random unimportant things like etiquette and ritual. Okay, some of those rituals included, if he wanted to show that he liked you, that he favored you as a noble and trusted you, he would give you the job of bringing him his breakfast in the morning, a high honor. He might give you the job of passing him his shirt as he gets dressed in the morning. another high honor. The highest honor, the honor that all the nobles fought over to have the right to do, was to be the royal butt wiper. Okay, to accompany Louis XIV to the bathroom and wipe his butt for him. Because that signified that you were the highest ranking noble, that you were very trusted, because this is when the king is at his most vulnerable, and he may be like talking, passing the time, and asking you for advice. Okay, so that may seem like, oh, gross, that's not really something that you should be fighting other nobles for, but that's the point. He creates this type of culture to distract them from trying to overthrow him. Okay, so he ends up having absolute control over the nobility, because remember, there's a continuity during this time period of the king and the nobles always being in a power struggle. Well, he eliminates the threat of the nobles by keeping them at his palace. Are we good so far? Now, there are some videos in the lecture unit on Versailles that it would really, really benefit you to watch, because it just goes into detail about how extravagant this palace was. Like, there's gold coating everything. Like you can see up here, there's gold gilded arches. There are statues everywhere. There's fancy fountains and gardens and a hallway full of mirrors, which y'all, back then mirrors were very rare and very expensive, because you have to make glass and then you have to cover it with a reflective coating of silver. And they had an entire hallway of mirrors in the palace. Okay, so this is super expensive, and guess who's paying for it? The peasants, the third estate. In addition to trying to control the nobles through Versailles, Louis XIV is also going to use the divine right theory to support his rule. Okay, remember, you can't talk about absolutism unless you discuss the divine right theory. Under this, the church and the state work very, very closely to maintain the status quo. Okay, so under Louis XIV, as the head of the Gallican church, and Gallican just means French. Okay, it comes from the word Gaul from ancient Rome, where the barbarians north of the Roman Empire came from Gaul, which was modern day France. So when you see Gallican, it refers to the French. So as the king, he is the head of the French Catholic Church. He is Catholic. Now the Pope controls the Catholic Church, and he said, the king said, that the Pope should have religious control, but should not interfere with state policies. The state policies, the government policies, those are the purview of the king. So the church and the state is working together to maintain the status quo of absolutism. Now, as the head of the Catholic Church, Louis XIV said, I have a duty to save people's souls. The Catholic Church is the one true church. Every other religion is a false religion. Therefore, I need to make France as Catholic as possible. So he institutes a policy known as the one king, one law, one faith policy. In French, that's un roi, representing king, une loi, representing law, and une foi, representing faith. So is there a Pope of the French church, or is it just the king? No. There's the Pope of the Catholic Church, the whole Catholic Church. All right, so the Catholic Church in England, Denmark, Germany, France, they all have the same Pope who lives in Rome. The king is the head of the French Catholic Church, okay? And so he's the king, and he's going to try to maintain Catholicism. Okay, but the king is in control of the political aspects, the Pope is in control of the religious aspects, and the king is trying to make France more Catholic because he's Catholic. He says that since I'm the king and I'm Catholic, then everybody else in my country should worship the same God that I worship, because that God put me in power. So if someone worships a Protestant God, like the Huguenots did, well, what if their version of God didn't support Louis XIV's right to rule? That would be political disobedience. That would be treason. And so he views the Huguenots, the French Calvinist Protestants as political threats to his power as nobles who worship a different religion. And the fact that they are worshiping a religion different than the king's is a form of political disobedience. And political disobedience is punishable. Okay, so he could have them arrested or killed. But wait a second. Y'all may remember that under Henry IV, Henry of Navarre, Huguenots were allowed the right to practice under the Edict of Nantes. Because even though Louis IV converted to Catholicism, he didn't do it because he truly believed in Catholicism. He did it because he knew the king would have to be Catholic if he was going to stay king. So when Henry IV issued the Edict of Nantes, he extended religious tolerance to the Huguenots. Louis XIV, his grandson, is going to take that away. Louis XIV issues the Edict of Fontainebleau. This says that if you live in France, you have to be Catholic or else. Well, what's the last time the Huguenots were persecuted? Oh yeah, it was at Henry IV's wedding with the St. Bartholomew Day massacre, where tens of thousands of Protestants died at the hands of Catholics. And so the Huguenots are going to say, hey, this Edict of Fontainebleau, this does not bode well for us. They're outlawing our religion again. The last time a Catholic monarch did this, a lot of us got murdered. So how about we leave France? Let's go somewhere where it's safe to practice our religion. So about 200,000 Huguenots are going to flee to areas in Europe where they can practice their Protestant religion. Okay, now remember, the Huguenots made up about half of the noble class, half of the second estate, and they had a ton of money. Well, when they leave France, are they just going to leave their money behind and say, hey, first come, first serve, you can have it, moving sale? No, they're going to flee France and take their wealth with them. This is going to be very bad for the French economy, okay? Because if the French nobles, the Huguenots, aren't living in France, they're not spending their money in France. They're not stimulating the economy. So with the flight of the Huguenots, we also see a lot of money go with them to other countries. So this is going to have a cause and effect relationship of a negative effect on France economically. Are we good so far? All right. In addition to the Huguenots leaving, causing some economic woes, the many, many wars that Louis XIV fights during his 72-year reign is going to drain the treasury. So his wars are going to have a very, very high cost. They're going to be economically ruinous. The most important of those wars and the most devastating of those wars is the War of Spanish Succession. So y'all may remember when we talked about the Habsburg family in Spain, the last of the Habsburgs was Charles II. Remember, he was Sexy Squidward. Okay, now Sexy Squidward couldn't have any children because of all the inbreeding that had happened in the Habsburg family. So when he died, who was supposed to rule Spain? Well, in his will, Charles II left Spain to the grandson of Louis XIV. Now, this is great for France because they could rule both France and Spain at the same time. They would all be under the Bourbon Dynasty's control. But the rest of Europe is going to have a big problem with this. They're going to say, wait a second, so you're saying France is going to control France, but it's also going to control Spain. That's a lot of power. We fight wars over power now. We don't fight over religion. We don't care if Spain is Catholic or France is Catholic, blah, blah, blah. We care if one European country is getting a little bit too powerful and makes the rest of us nervous. Okay, so this change, okay, this inheritance by Louis XIV's grandson disrupted the balance of power. And so the rest of Europe is going to join together to fight this exchange. They're going to try to prevent the Bourbon family from ruling over Spain. It's not about religion, it's about politics, it's about power. And so the European countries of England, the Netherlands, what remains of the Holy Roman Empire, even Portugal in the Iberian Peninsula, are going to form an alliance, the Grand Alliance, to go to war against Spain and France, because they don't want the Bourbon Dynasty to rule both of those countries at the same time. So Louis XIV goes to war for 12 years, over a decade of fighting, to make sure that his grandson can one day inherit both of the thrones of Spain and France. But he is going to be unsuccessful. The Grand Alliance wins this war. And in the Treaty of Utrecht, they say that you cannot have the Bourbon Dynasty rule both Spain and France at the same time. So they're going to say, hey, Louis XIV's grandson, you can have Spain, but you have to give up any claim to France. You cannot have both. You can pick one. And so as a result of this war, the unification of Spain and France is going to be prohibited. That maintains the balance of power in Europe. Okay? In addition to that, it's also going to end Louis XIV's expansion of France. They're going to limit him and say, okay, you can't keep expanding. You're spending too much money. Your army is depleted. And so he's going to give up. He's not going to want to fight any more wars after this. Someone asked, why didn't this happen with the Habsburgs and the Holy Roman Empire in Spain? Because at the time the 30 Years' War was fought, wars were fought over religion instead of balance and power. And the Habsburg Dynasty had already been weakened after the 30 Years' War, because the Holy Roman Empire essentially broke up into 300 different provinces, each ruled by its own noble lord. So the Habsburgs were already critically hit by the 30 Years' War. That's when we first get the shift into balance of power politics instead of religious wars. Okay. The biggest winner out of this treaty, out of this war, is going to be Britain. Y'all may remember that Portugal lost the Asiento once their empire declined to Spain. Spain, right, had been suffering post 1588 after the defeat of their Spanish Armada, and also after the 30 Years' War. And so when Spain loses this war against the Grand Alliance, Britain is going to take over the African slave trade. That's going to be very lucrative. It's going to make them wealthy. In addition to that, they get another form of wealth. They get land in Gibraltar and Minorca. Belgium is given to Austria, which was a part of the Holy Roman Empire, but we don't really focus too much on that in this curriculum. That's more important in AP European history. Okay, so it's important to note that in the 16th century, Spain was on the rise. The Treaty of Tordesillas had given them almost all of the Americas except for Brazil. They were importing all the silver and cash crops, and they were building up their military. Then in 1588, they lose the Spanish Armada to England. Then by 1648, they have lost the 30 Years' War and thus lost the Holy Roman Empire. Okay, so by the 17th century, which is the 1600s, this is the 1500s. By the 1600s, France, under Louis XIV, has become the major superpower of Europe. Then once France declines after Louis XIV's rule, in the 18th century, okay, which is the 1700s, England becomes the major superpower of Europe. Does that make sense so far? That's why in our next lecture series, we're going to focus on England, okay, and what's going on there with absolutism and constitutionalism, because they replace France as the next superpower of Europe. Now, all these wars that Louis XIV was fighting were economically ruinous for France. They destroyed the French economy. okay? Because all the taxes that they've gathered from the third estate have been spent on wars that they lost and spent on the Palace of Versailles. Okay, remember, the first estate and the second estate don't pay taxes. And the wealthy members of the third estate bought titles of nobility so they could become a part of the second estate and thus be exempt from taxes. And so the peasants are going to be paying a lot of money for the nobles and the king to live it up and to spend on fruitless wars. So the French economy is going to be wrecked after Louis XIV. And that's going to be really bad for his successor, Louis XV, and especially Louis XVI. In addition to the cost of war in terms of money, you also have the cost in terms of life. 1 in 5 French people over Louis XIV's rule are going to die due to these wars because you have to send people to fight the wars. So the French economy is wrecked, the population suffers, and the government runs out of money, which means they're going to keep raising taxes on the third estate. And the third estate is going to get sick and tired of all of those taxes. So the financial and social tensions, not just because the government is bankrupt, but because the third estate has to carry the debt, that's going to lead to causation. That's going to lead to the French Revolution, where Louis XVI is going to lose his head. And a lot of people are going to have their heads cut off as a result of the overthrow of the absolute monarchy of France.